Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today will be part 3 of our discussion about Freemasonry Isn't Dying, It's Refining by Robert H. Johnson, and a couple more articles that we'll probably get to this episode.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Hello, I'm Very Worshipful Brother Matthew Appel. I'm a Mason here at Mill Creek number 243 in Montlake Terrace, Washington, and I'm joined by two of our other usual co-hosts. We have Very Worshipful Brother David Colbeth, who's in King Solomon number 60 in Auburn, Washington, and Worshipful Brother Jarrod Dunham from Penticton number 147 up in Penticton, British Columbia. And Steve couldn't be here tonight, but we'll hopefully we'll do him proud and continue our conversation here on this article. So there's one more thing that I just sort of want to hit on about the article, and then, to make a long story long, I got to this article by reading a couple other articles and thinking about suggesting them for the show, and I put them in the list too, and I think they elicited some commentary from the peanut gallery here, so I think we're gonna briefly touch on at least one of those articles as well. But one of the ideas that Robert has in this article, which I should add, we are using by permission. I emailed him and he said essentially, stop asking me for permission to use my articles, just go ahead and do it. But we're gonna, one of the interesting ideas that he has is talking about having a Grand Lodge of the United States and eliminating some of the statewide organizations in an effort to streamline the overall Masonry, the hierarchy, the structure of Masonry that sits on top of the lodges. And I know, Brian, for instance, in the Grand Lodge of Alaska used to be part of Washington. What was the Grand Lodge of Washington and Alaska? I guess I don't even know the formal title. But and then they broke off in the 80s, I want to say. David, save me from myself.
I can't, but I think that's right.
But anyway, so my point is there is precedent for more than one state or province or whatever being under part of the same Grand Lodge. And I know that there's that's right, British Columbia and Yukon, for instance, just for instance. So I know that there is a Grand Lodge of Canada
in the province of Ontario.
And sort of, I guess I wanted to see how the Grand Lodge of Canada is working out for you guys up there. Jarrod, I know that you know a little bit of the history of that organization.
Well, okay, so the Grand Lodge of Canada was formed back when what became Ontario and Quebec were known as Upper and Lower Canada. So technically it was the Grand Lodge of Canada. And I'm trying to remember exactly. I believe what happened was Masons in Quebec went and formed the Grand Lodge of Quebec. And so it ceased to be because it ceased to be the Grand Lodge of both Canadas, they had to, and I don't remember when this happened, that basically they had to change the name to the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario. Because I know when I joined back in the early 90s, I heard about, the Grand Lodge of Canada, and I thought it was like, the United Grand Lodge of England, where it was, we've got our provincial Grand Lodges and there's an overarching Grand Lodge, and was sadly dissuaded that wasn't right. So, but yeah. I've condensed it really quickly, but yeah, it was formed back when Ontario and Quebec were known as Upper and Lower Canada.
And it seems, I don't know how things are going in Alaska right now. If I were to pick two states, I guess first of all, we're talking to non-Masons. All the Grand Lodges of all these places we're talking about are equals. So essentially the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon, and the Grand Lodge of Washington, and the Grand Lodge of Hawaii, and the Grand Lodge of wherever, the Philippines, or I'm sure I'm going to put my foot in my mouth if I start naming more places. So I'm just going to say all those Grand Lodges are equals. And there's although a lot of deference is paid to the United Grand Lodge of England, because that's where things started, in reality, the Grand Lodge of Washington reigns supreme for Masonic purposes, more or less. in the state of Washington and is equal to the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon, just at a different place. So, but I can see in my mind the Grand Lodge of Connecticut and the Grand Lodge of Rhode Island, just to choose two Grand Lodges I'm completely ignorant about. And if both of those organizations have few enough lodges and are small enough, maybe there's a Grand Lodge of Southern New England or something like that. In my mind, I could see that happening. Is that, I guess, do you guys, I personally find it difficult to believe that the United States is a easy enough to manage organization that you would have one Grand Lodge across all of it. But
well, you have one government that still doesn't run the entire. I mean, like, it's the same thing here in Canada.
I was just thinking that.
You have a government that doesn't run everything the way everyone likes to. It'll never, So I mean, I'm not saying that it's not possible, because we as Freemasons get along a lot better than But I think it's interesting, because one of the things I think about with North Americans is that we forget how large our countries are geographically. Like, I mean, England, like Great Britain. Let's take all of England, Scotland, Wales, and the two Irelands and stuff. Geographically is a small enough area that you can drive from one tip to the other in a day, I think. Whereas Canada takes, to go from Victoria to St. John's, New Brunswick is a week-long drive. So I don't see how we could do a national Grand Lodge. I mean, God, can you imagine being the Grand Master and having to visit every lodge?
Yeah. Well, that begs the point of, first of all, it begs the point of importance of the Grand Masters, because that is, having to go to your local, I don't remember the lodge that has the Sabine and Belly, so I'm sorry guys if you're listening, but the requirement, the expectation that the Grand Master is going to go to the Sabine and Belly feed in lodge number 296 in the far corners of BC or far corners of Washington or wherever, and 5 guys show up, is a downfall of the idea of what the Grand Master visit should really be about, in my opinion. That's just a total side note. But yeah, the idea of a regional, maybe there should be some kind of, hey, if you need to have 10,000 members and 100 lodges or something, or 200 lodges or whatever, to be able to have a Grand Lodge.
Careful when you say that, because Washington doesn't have either of those things. So.
Exactly, right? Exactly. I mean, if you listen to the show before, at the very end, I alluded to some legislation that says that we should. I think Washington should do what BC does and other jurisdictions do for maintenance of charters, in that you should be able to. Could your lodge earn its charter today? And so part of my marketing is going to be that, hey, my lodge can't do that. If we were required to get our charter today, we couldn't do all the work. We couldn't do that. So yeah, Washington doesn't qualify. So if, as we do, maybe we would lower the standards just enough so that we could maintain our status as a Grand Lodge.
So I guess that also begs the question of how important is the Grand Lodge bureaucracy? Like, does it really, like, theoretically, if you have 2 lodges in a region, they can form a Grand Lodge, because Grand Lodge is formed by the consent of the lodges in the area. Like in BC, when the Grand Lodge of BC was formed, there were 8 lodges chartered under, I don't know if there were any under the Irish. I know there were from Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and they petitioned to form a Grand Lodge. So theoretically, as long as you have 2 lodges, you can still have a Grand Lodge. And how important is it that you consolidate regions in order to justify the Grand Lodge, or do you just justify the Grand Lodge by, it's been here, we've still got lodges here, we still need it, but maybe in a smaller format?
I think it to define what the purpose of the Grand Lodge is, and it's once you know what the purpose of the Grand Lodge is, then you can say, well, it should have these duties. And to have these duties, you need to have certain staff, if you will, and certain processes and abilities to conduct those things. And that automatically translates to dollars and people.
So you guys have just, I think, broke my brain, because now I'm trying to think of what is the point of a Grand Lodge? I mean, other than, I guess the first, I mean,
that's the last we heard of Matt Appel.
Exactly. And here's my dues card, Grandmaster. But if you, I mean, essentially, what do we do? The Grand Lodge, on some level, verifies that we are Masons that can travel to other Grand Lodge areas, right? It sort of provides some level of legitimacy for us as Masons.
It's kind of like my argument. What's the purpose of a lodge? The purpose of a lodge is strictly to make Masons, because without the charter, you can still do everything a lodge can do. You can still have the meetings and talk about Masonry and do Masonic stuff. You can even have practice. You can even practice ritual. You can do everything a lodge can do without a charter, except you can't make a new Mason. And so what is a Grand Lodge? Grand Lodge's only function, really, is to charter new lodges, right?
Grand Lodge confers legitimacy on what we do.
But in reality, if we really break it down, a lodge's function is to make new Masons, and a Grand Lodge's function is to make new lodges.
Right.
I don't know that making new lodges is the...
Well, it has the authority to. I mean, I'm not saying that's their purpose, but it has the authority to. Otherwise, what do we need, like you said, what do we need a Grand Lodge for? You don't need a Grand Lodge to do everything that we can make Masons. If we had a charter from Oregon, we could make Masons and do everything. It just would be under the Charter of Oregon.
Right. And in that instance, the Grand Lodge of Oregon would be saying, this is a legitimate lodge. This is a regular lodge. The Masons they make are real Masons. This isn't some whatever fly-by-night here to make money organization. This is a legitimate lodge. And therefore, when we show up in Missouri or British Columbia, those guys will go, oh yeah, we've heard of Oregon. That's a good place.
And that goes to Jarrod's point. It gives legitimacy to the Grand Lodge and to those lodges under the regular lodge system, which there isn't. But we made it up. But again, I think ultimately a Grand Lodge, their only function is to grant charters for new lodges.
But okay,
I mean, all the structure to go with it.
So, but basically, that's what any I got to think of this. That's basically what any organizational head office is like. Boy Scouts, like scouting, because it's not just boys up here in Canada.
Or here anymore either. It's now the
Have you guys gone co-ed?
Scouting BSA or whatever they call it. Yeah.
Okay, but yeah, so scouting.
Boy Scouts.
But if you think about it, that's the same thing as like the Scouts Canada. It basically lends legitimacy to the regional areas that lend legitimacy to the troops and stuff, that they are following the protocols and the teachings and the purpose of that organization. So I mean, the argument that you're making is for any organization, really. We're not special. So I mean that to say that, I mean, you're talking about anarchy here, because to get rid of all of that.
No, I would agree, and I think it goes right to your point that that is an element of the Grand Lodge. Having a Grand Lodge in your area or being under a Grand Lodge gives legitimacy, like Matt was saying too, that it gives legitimacy across borders, across the world, if you will, in the scope of a regular lodge. Like the three of us can form our own lodges, and because there's two of us, we could then say, hey, we're going to call it the Grand Lodge of the Working Tools, and now we have our own Grand Lodge, but it's not record, it doesn't give legitimacy. So we're a clandestine lodge under the regular Blue Lodge system, and so that wouldn't work in a sense. But because we have a Grand Lodge that's recognized by other Grand Lodges, then we're legitimate under the regular Blue Lodge Grand Lodge system. But really, what's the purpose of, other than that, what's the purpose of a Grand Lodge? Why do we want to why do we want to have our own Grand Lodge?
I would argue, I guess, that the other side of the other sharp edge of that sword, the other side of the coin, something like that, on that is that in order to say this is a legitimate lodge, that they are going to hold their lodges to some standard of they use ritual, they, you know, whatever, don't, I mean, in our case, they don't, you know, admit old men in dotage and whatever. They follow this sort of baseline standard of what is Masonry, and so therefore they have to have some kind of enforcement arm to make sure that all of us children don't go running off.
In theory, that's the case, right? But once the charter is granted, it's perpetual. It can't be. It's very difficult. That's what our code says. I actually looked it up. I was shocked. I couldn't believe they used that word, perpetual charter. And yeah, I was, anyway.
Because there are actual examples up here of lodges having their charters yanked for reason.
Sure, the Grand Master can arrest a charter,
right?
But it's my understanding. I haven't really defined the set of rules around it, other than on Masonic conduct. And I have had several press Grand Masters that have said it's actually a very thin opportunity to arrest a charter. You have to have some pretty heavy reasons. A lodge really has to mess up really bad to be in jeopardy of losing its charter, and it's the Grand Master doesn't have as much. I don't know. I mean, to downplay, and that we're gonna be on the show with the Grand Master here in a couple of weeks. I don't mean to downplay his authority, but the Grand Master really doesn't have a whole. Honestly, when you really look at it, the Grand Master doesn't have a lot of authority directly to just go and do whatever he wants. I mean, I guess he could do it, and then what are they going to do? Slap his hand later? But he's not going to be deposed himself. Most likely, it would be pretty tough to depose. But back to the idea of what's the purpose of a Grand Lodge? I think if we again look at it kind of like the purpose of a lodge. What's the purpose of a lodge? Is the purpose of a lodge to make Masons? I mean, no. I know there's other things. What the purpose? You know, the lodge.
That's what a lodge does, but that's not what the purpose of the lodge. The purpose of the lodge is to bring people together, and for the purpose of practicing Freemasonry.
But you could do that without a charter.
But it wouldn't be Freemasonry.
Why wouldn't it?
Because the charter is what makes it Freemasonry.
So
it's the same thing. Okay, so
only because they're Freemasons under that charter. But what if the three of us are from different lodges already and we come together? Are we not practicing Freemasonry outside? So is this not?
We're practicing Freemasonry, but we're all, each of us individually, members of a lodge.
But we can't make a Mason. If we said they were going to form the Working Tools Club or Working Tools Lodge, really, we can't make Masons here. And so the only way to do that, if we wanted to make Masons under the Working Tools name, we'd have to create a lodge and obtain a charter.
Yes.
So that's my point. The idea is that we can't. The purpose of a charter. Why do you have a charter? So that you can make Masons. Otherwise, we can do everything a lodge could do as Masons without a charter. But a charter gives you legitimacy. A charter gives you the opportunity to make Masons. And so if we translate that idea to Grand Lodge, yes, the Grand Lodge has lots of function and purpose, but without a Grand Lodge doesn't mean that you're not a lodge, because you could be chartered from somewhere else.
Yeah. I'm not arguing with your point. I think that by boiling down the purpose of a lodge to just to be making Freemasons is reducing Freemasonry to something less than what it really is.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, I know that that's the extreme of the argument, is that, you know, that is, you know, but there is so much more to it than just that. And I think this is the problem. Like, we get into this with, there is more to a Grand Lodge than just creating lodges and stuff. But the problem is when we allow the growth of Grand Lodges, of the Grand Lodge's functions without keeping in mind the size of the group that it is trying to perform these functions for.
Sure. Yeah. And then, as Matt was kind of to bring it back home with the idea of a national I mean, if you look at Scottish Rite, it has a pseudo-national organization, at least a southern jurisdiction does, in North America. And then Shrine has a imperial, a national organization, and even York groups, the York Rite has national bodies. And no offense, guys, but I don't think that any of them function better with having a national organization.
And I would even argue there are fewer, maybe not. There aren't a whole lot of shrines,
Clubs.
shrine units.
Clubs. Shrine
Across the
clubs.
center.
Shrine clubs.
But we would call a club a local group.
Yeah.
So that the temple is a shrine temple.
Right.
Yeah, whatever they are. Okay, so
Whatever.
fine. Scottish Rite. There aren't nearly as many Scottish Rite valleys across the southern jurisdiction as there are Blue Lodges, and I think that would make it much more awkward to administer as a centralized body. But anyway, so moving on from that topic, although we're 25 minutes in at this point, we're never going to get to these other articles, are we? I do feel obligated to say that the Grand Master of Washington may may arrest the charter of any lodge for dereliction of duty or other unmasonic conduct. So it's not that hard.
Yeah, again, for it to really, I don't know the process for that. If he were to arrest a charter, then would it immediately go to jurisprudence in Washington? The process, it would immediately go to jurisprudence, and how would the lodge appeal and all that kind of stuff? And
yeah, that gets voted on at the subsequent annual communication. And anyway, yeah, I'm sure there's a whole procedure. But anyway, the point is, it can be done.
Yeah.
So I lost my brain here. We're 26 minutes, 27 minutes in. Do we want to bring up the other article now? Do we want to just talk about it next time? How do we want to do that?
Talk about it next time, I think.
Okay. Are we doing it? Well, yeah. How the sausage is made on the Working Tools
About
podcast.
Masonry.
So on that note of professionalism there, thank you all for listening to the Working Tools podcast. We'd like to hear your comments or see your comments on the various platforms. If you want to leave a comment for us, we'd be happy to interact with you about them. And I think that's where a lot of the rubber meets the road as far as these ideas. And so on behalf of Jarrod and David and myself and the absent Steve, thank you all for listening to the Working Tools podcast. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye.